There is a hole in a wall in the very first episode of Regular Show that nobody watching that night in September of 2010 had any reason to think mattered. Two 23-year-old groundskeepers wrestling around in their bedroom, a raccoon flung into drywall like a cannonball, a crack spreading out from the point of impact, the way a crack spreads out from any small violence that happens indoors when nobody is supposed to be watching. Mordecai and Rigby look at that hole the way you look at a mistake you already know is going to cost you money you do not have. And because they cannot pay for it, and because they are 23 and allergic to consequences, they go looking for a shortcut instead of a solution. That shortcut turns out to be a stolen keyboard taken from a wizard relieving himself in some bushes. An instrument that grants whoever plays it the power to bend reality itself. A compelling voice capable of sending a Yeti to the actual surface of the moon over a simple mishearing of the word room. Skips almost dies up there. The universe nearly loses one of its oldest and steadiest workers because two young men wanted $40 to patch some plaster, and when it is over, when Benson has confiscated the keyboard and broken it in half as punishment, when the $40 is handed back and the threat of getting fired has passed, Mordecai does the thing he should have done from the very beginning. He picks up a poster off the floor and tapes it over the hole. Problem solved, at least on the surface. The wall looks fine now. Nobody can see what is underneath it. That is where the first episode ends, and for the 7 years and 8 seasons that followed, most people who loved this show simply moved on to whatever ludicrous errand came next. Rock, paper, scissors for a couch. A karaoke tape that must never be found. A demon living inside a keyboard-shaped grudge. The show kept escalating so quickly, week after week, that there was rarely time to look back at where any of it had started. But tonight, that is exactly what we are doing. Tonight we are going back through 8 seasons of Regular Show, looking for the small thing that caused the big thing, the quiet decision that quietly detonated years later, the moment nobody flagged as important, that turned out, when you trace it all the way through, to be the hinge the entire story swung on. Every long-running show accumulates a few of these if it runs long enough. Regular Show accumulated an unusual number of them, and an unusual number of the biggest ones connect directly back to that first, mundane, completely avoidable hole in a bedroom wall, because here is the detail almost nobody sits with long enough to notice. That broken keyboard does not disappear from the story. It gets fixed later on, folded quietly into a fusion of several old side characters, and it shows up again, both broken and whole, tucked into Mordecai's closet across multiple episodes, like something the show refuses to fully let go of. And then, in the very last stretch of the very last season, in the 3-part finale that decided whether the universe itself would survive, Mordecai and Rigby dig that same keyboard back out. They use the power, the actual named object from episode 1, to skip ahead to the end of everything and put themselves back inside the final battle between Pops and his brother at the exact moment they are needed most. The first mistake of the series and the last rescue of the series are, quite literally, the same object. That is not a coincidence. anyone announced out loud. J.G. Quintel and his writers built the whole show without a lot of interest in flashing signs that said, "Remember this for later." But once you know where to look, the show is absolutely riddled with these small hinges, doors that swing open years after somebody first touched the handle. And the honest way to talk about 8 seasons of regular show is to talk about them the way water finds its way downhill, one tiny decision at a time, until you look up and the whole landscape has been carved by things that individually looked like nothing. Let's actually sit inside that first one a little longer before we move on, because it deserves more than a passing mention. The keyboard itself was never meant to be some cosmic artifact when Rigby grabbed it. He stole it because a wizard happened to set it down to relieve himself in some bushes, which is about as low stakes and almost accidental a way to acquire a reality-altering object as any writer has ever devised. There was no ritual, there was no prophecy. There was a lazy raccoon, an unattended keyboard, and an opportunity that most people would have walked past without a second thought. And once Mordecai and Rigby have it in their hands, they do not even understand what it does at first. They think it just gives them a persuasive voice, something to talk Benson into a raise with. It is only by pure mishearing, Mordecai telling Skips to go back to his room, and Rigby garbling it into "go to the moon," that the keyboard's actual scope becomes clear, and by then the situation has already spiraled into an emergency that could have killed one of the show's oldest and most careful characters. If you want to locate the actual moment, the entire mythology of regular show begins to take shape. The moment that quietly seeds the idea that this park is sitting on top of forces far larger than lawn care, you could make a very reasonable case that it happens in the first 11 minutes of the first episode in a joke about wall damage that most of the audience laughed at and then forgot. It did not stay forgotten. The show remembered. It just waited 8 years to remind you that it had. Before we keep walking further into the park tonight, tell me where you are watching this from and what time it is where you are. I like knowing that. It helps me picture the room. Somewhere out there, somebody is watching this at 2 in the morning with the phone propped against a pillow, and somebody else is watching it on a lunch break in the middle of the afternoon on the other side of the world, and both of you are welcome here. Put it in the comments if you feel like it. Now let's keep going, because the wall in the bedroom is only the beginning of this, and the next hinge we need to look at did not happen inside the show at all. It happened years earlier, in a classroom, before there was a park, before there was a Mordecai, before there was anything you would recognize. If you want to understand why regular show exists in the first place, and why so many of its earliest ideas feel like they were carried in from somewhere else and set down gently rather than invented fresh for the occasion, you have to go back to a game college animation students used to play at the California Institute of the Arts sometime in the middle of the 2000s. J.G. Quintel and a group of roughly 20 classmates would gather at midnight and throw scraps of paper with single words written on them into a hat. Somebody would pull one out and read it aloud, and from that one word, drawn essentially at random, each student would then have exactly 48 hours to build an entire short film. No pitch meeting, no months of development, just a word, a deadline, and whatever came out of you under that kind of pressure. This is, by any reasonable definition, one of the purest butterfly effect machines a group of young artists could have built for themselves, because it means that entire careers, entire tones of voice, entire fictional worlds were being seeded by whichever scrap of paper happened to come out of the hat that particular midnight. In the spring of 2005, one of those words led Quintel to a short film about an ambassador who loses his composure during an otherwise unremarkable diplomatic encounter. He called it The Naive Man from Lollyland. It is a strange, small, mostly forgotten student project by any ordinary measure, and yet if you go back and look at it now, you can see, plainly, the design and the temperament of the character who would eventually become Pops. The sweetness, the slight disconnection from how normal people behave, the sense of someone who belongs somewhere else and has wandered gently into a world he does not entirely understand. That character did not begin as a cosmic being destined to fight his own brother for the fate of existence. He began as a homework assignment built around a word pulled out of a hat at midnight by a tired art student trying to make a deadline. A year or so later, working within roughly the same creative habit, Quintel put together a second short called 2 in the AM/PM, about two slackers left alone to run a convenience store on Halloween night, while candy laced with something dangerous causes a small, localized nightmare. Some of the character work from that short, the loose, low-stakes, low-responsibility energy of young men minding a job they do not particularly respect, carried forward too. You can feel its fingerprints on the relationship between Mordecai and Benson, especially, the employee who does not want to be there, and the manager who is somehow even less thrilled about it than he is. None of this was written with 8 seasons in mind. None of it was written with any seasons in mind. These were assignments, and they only survived to become anything more than assignments because of what happened next, which is its own small miracle of accidental timing. Cartoon Network, around 2008, ran something called the Cartoon Institute, an initiative that let young, mostly unproven artists pitch pilot shorts with essentially no creative interference from the network, no focus groups, no notes, just permission to make whatever strange thing they actually wanted to make, on the theory that some of those shorts might eventually be developed into full series. Quintel, who had been working at the network on other people's shows, storyboarding for Camp Lazlo, and later serving as creative director on The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack, was invited to pitch something of his own. He did not feel confident that a verbal pitch would land, because the concept, in his own telling, would have sounded like nonsense out loud if he had simply tried to describe it in a room full of executives. So instead, he built an entire storyboarded pitch, essentially a visual argument for the show rather than a spoken one, pulling the characters from those 2 forgotten student shorts and placing them inside a new setting, a public park, a couple of groundskeepers, a gumball machine boss, a Yeti. 2 of the people who happened to review that pitch and respond well to it were Craig McCracken and Rob Renzetti, both established figures in animation in their own right, and their approval was part of what got Regular Show greenlit. Here's the detail that makes this whole chain worth sitting with for a moment, because it is almost too tidy to be believed, and yet it happened exactly this way. The Cartoonstitute itself, the entire umbrella project that Regular Show was pitched under, was ultimately scrapped. It never aired as its own program. It does not exist as a thing you can go watch today. And yet 2 of the pilots developed for that canceled project were pulled out individually and greenlit as their own full series regardless. Regular Show and a show called Secret Mountain Fort Awesome, which had itself grown out of a short called Uncle Grandpa that would later, in a separate and entirely unrelated turn of events, become its own standalone series as well. A shelved anthology program that never once appeared on television quietly produced 2 full-length animated shows and, indirectly, a third. That is the shape of a butterfly effect in miniature, an initiative that failed on its own terms while succeeding almost by accident at the individual level, scattering its surviving pieces outward into projects far bigger than the container that first held them. And it does not stop there, because Quintel did not develop any of this in isolation. He went to school alongside 2 other students who would go on to shape Cartoon Network's identity for the following decade in ways that are hard to overstate now, looking back. One of his classmates was Thurup Van Orman, who created the marvelous misadventures of Flapjack, the very show Quintel worked on as creative director before Regular Show existed. Another was Pendleton Ward, who created Adventure Time, a show that would premiere the very same year as Regular Show, air its pilot episode literally minutes before the power on the same night in September of 2010, and go on to define, alongside Regular Show, an entire era of what Cartoon Network programming could sound and feel like. This is not a coincidence in any mystical sense, to be clear, and it would be irresponsible to frame it as one. 3 friends went to the same art school at the same time, absorbed some of the same influences, worked briefly on some of the same shows, and each independently built something that became foundational to the same network within a few years of each other. But it is worth pausing on regardless, because it means that a huge portion of the animated comedy landscape you might remember most fondly from around 2010 through the middle of that decade traces back to one classroom, one small cohort of art students pulling words out of a hat at midnight, trying to make each other laugh under a 48-hour deadline, with absolutely no idea what any of it would eventually become. Somewhere in that room, before there was a single frame of finished animation, before there was a park or a jay or a raccoon, the entire shape of the next decade of children's television was already quietly beginning to take form, the way weather systems begin as small temperature differences nobody on the ground can feel yet. There is one more piece of this origin thread worth mentioning before we move deeper into the show itself, because it involves a detail so small it almost does not qualify as a decision at all. The character of Rigby, according to Quintel's own account of the process, was not designed with any particular plan in mind. He simply drew a raccoon hula hooping, liked the shape of it, and built outward from there, developing the character to be far less responsible and far more chaotic than his eventual best friend. A doodle, not a script note, not a character Bible entry, just a shape on a page that happened to appeal to the person holding the pencil that day. And from that doodle came the character who would 8 seasons and 240 some episodes later drop out of high school, fall in love with a mole who worked at a coffee shop, technically die more than once, get resurrected through an arm wrestling match against death himself, and eventually marry that same mole and build the kind of steady, hard-won adult life the show seems to regard as its quietest and most sincere argument about what growing up actually looks like. All of that traces back, if you follow the thread all the way to its source, to somebody enjoying the way a raccoon looked when they drew it, holding a hula hoop. That is speculation in the sense that we cannot know exactly how much of Rigby's eventual arc Quintel was carrying in his head at the moment he made that doodle, and it is worth being honest about that uncertainty rather than pretending the connection was inevitable. But the documented starting point itself, the doodle, the word from the hat, the storyboarded pitch built from forgotten homework, all of that is on the record, confirmed by Quintel in interviews given around the show's early seasons. The show you watched, if you watched it, exists because of a chain of almost weightless decisions made by tired art students trying to entertain each other, and none of those students had any way of knowing, at the time, which of their throwaway choices would still be mattering to people watching alone in the dark more than 15 years later. Let's move from the world behind the show into the world inside it, because the deepest butterfly effect regular show ever told was not about production history. It was about a school dance in a year the show places at an 1814, and a woman named Desdemona, who fans and the show itself both eventually shortened to Mona, and a decision made by a teenage boy named Walks about whether or not he was willing to fight. The episode is called Diary, and on the surface it has almost nothing to do with any of this. Mordecai and Rigby accidentally destroy Margaret's diary, and in trying to cover up the damage, they accidentally summon something called the Guardian of Secrets, an armored, furious entity who begins tearing through the city in pursuit of them, and who can only be stopped by the exposure of a genuine, deeply held secret. Skips is the one who ends the chase, and he ends it by revealing something he has clearly never told anyone in the park before. The real reason he skips everywhere instead of walking. It is a small, strange, almost throwaway detail about him that the show had been treating as pure comedy since episode 1, the same way it played his name as a gag, and in the space of about a minute, Diary turns that joke inside out and reveals that it was never really a joke at all. He explains that he once loved a woman who skipped everywhere with him, and that when he lost her, he made himself a promise never to walk again for as long as he lived, because walking was what he had been doing on the day he met her, and he could not bear to do the ordinary thing that ordinary loss usually allows people to keep doing. The show does not linger on it in that episode. It resolves the immediate crisis. The Guardian of Secrets calms down. The plot moves on to whatever chaos comes next, and for a long stretch of the series, that is basically all viewers were given. A wound, briefly opened, quickly closed again. It is only later, particularly in the flashback material that surrounds an episode called Skip's Story, that the full shape of what happened becomes clear, and it turns out to be one of the most quietly devastating backstories the show ever committed to. As a teenager, back when his name was Walks, he fell in with a small group calling themselves the Guardians of Eternal Youth, and through that association, he found himself in conflict with a bully named Clorgbane the Destroyer, a figure the school's headmaster could only barely keep in check, and a threat that Walks, over time, felt increasingly obligated to confront directly. Mona was the reason he almost did not. She disliked violence, and when the subject of fighting Clorgbane first came up between Walks and his friends, she made her feelings about it clear enough that he promised her, sincerely, that he would never fight again. For a while, that promise held. The two of them fell into an ordinary, sweet high school relationship, skipping together, going on dates, working side by side, decorating for the prom, and Walks, for a little while, got to simply be a teenage boy in love, rather than whatever destiny his friends kept trying to point him toward. It did not last, because Clorgbane forced the issue, showing up at the prom itself, the one occasion he was apparently willing to accept as the appropriate setting for the confrontation everyone had been circling for months. In the chaos that followed, a slab of concrete came down from above, and Mona, in the moment that mattered most, put herself in its path to save Walks, and died doing it. That single physical action, a girl pushing a boy out of the way of falling debris at a school dance in the year 1814, is the actual root of everything Skips becomes for the following 2 centuries and beyond. Grief is what pushed him to accept immortality from the Guardians of Eternal Youth, a gift he did not ask for and might never have wanted under different circumstances, offered specifically so that he could return once every 157 years to fight Clorgbane again whenever the creature resurfaced. Grief is what made him change his own name, choosing Skips deliberately, in memory of the specific, small, physical habit that had defined his time with her, because if he kept doing the thing they used to do together, in some private way, he got to keep doing it with her. And grief, quiet and folded away, and never once directly discussed by him in the ordinary run of the show, is what turned him into the character viewers spent 8 seasons watching hold the entire park together. The one who never seemed rattled, the one who always had the fix, the one whose patience read, once you knew the full history, less like a personality trait and more like the discipline of someone who has already survived losing the one thing that mattered to him and has decided, ever since, not to let anything else break him the same way. Here is where the butterfly effect widens outward from a single tragic evening into something closer to the entire structural skeleton of the show. Because Skips does not just carry his own grief quietly for 200 years, he becomes, functionally, the park's actual keeper. The show frames him repeatedly as the one who knows how everything works, the one other characters go to when a situation has moved past the reach of ordinary groundskeeping, the one who is never surprised by the cosmic strangeness that keeps surfacing on this particular patch of land. And it is difficult, once you know about Mona, not to read every one of those later moments through the lens of that single loss. His steadiness at the park is not separate from his grief. It may well be built directly out of it. The interpretation that his commitment to holding the park together is, at some level, a continuation of his commitment to Mona, a way of honoring a promise he made to a girl who wanted him to be gentle rather than combative, is speculation, not something the show ever states outright, but it is speculation that the show's own choices repeatedly invite. He agreed to fight only when there was no other option left, at the prom, in the moment Clorgbane forced his hand, and he has apparently spent the 2 centuries since fighting only when the cycle demanded it, and quietly, patiently, doing everything else the rest of the time. A single act of protective love from a teenage girl in 1814 produced an immortal groundskeeper whose steadiness the entire park would come to depend on for 200 years, all the way through a cosmic war that had nothing to do with her at all and would not exist within the story without the small, human decision she made in the seconds before that concrete fell. The next chain we should walk through together starts even smaller than a stolen keyboard or a school dance. It starts with a bag of loose change. Early in the show's 2nd season, in an episode called High Score, Mordecai and Rigby are simply tired of being disrespected. Benson keeps paying them in resealable plastic bags stuffed with random bills and coins instead of anything resembling a normal paycheck, and on top of that indignity, they get physically run over by 2 kids on skateboards on their way to the coffee shop. It is a small, almost petty injury to their pride, the kind of thing most people forget about within the hour. But Mordecai and Rigby decide, in the particular way 23-year-olds decide things, that the solution is to become genuinely good at something, specifically an arcade game at the coffee shop called Broken Bones, so that people will finally take them seriously. They grind at it. They start beating the 2 skateboarding kids who humiliated them. They start beating everyone. And eventually, almost by accident, in the way these things always seem to happen in this show, they find themselves closing in on the actual world record for the game, which turns out to be held by a mysterious figure known only by his initials, GBF. What arrives to defend that record is a floating, disembodied, bearded head who introduces himself with evident pride as Garrett Bobby Ferguson, and who makes it immediately clear that the world record Mordecai and Rigby are chasing is nothing compared to what he actually holds, the universe record, a score exactly 1 point higher, the kind of margin that exists specifically so that someone can say they have never truly been beaten. What follows is a fairly ordinary competitive escalation right up until the moment Ferguson, sensing he is about to lose, invents an elaborate sob story on the spot, claiming the game is the only thing left in his life after his wife walked out on him because of how much time he devoted to it. Mordecai and Rigby, in a moment of what the show frames as genuine, if slightly reluctant decency, choose to throw the match rather than take something that means that much to a man who has apparently lost everything else. Ferguson immediately reveals that every word of it was a lie, that he has never had a wife, that the game is merely a hobby to him, and that he manipulated 2 decent young men into surrendering a victory they had rightfully earned purely to protect his own ego. It is, structurally, exactly the kind of low, mean, disposable villain the show built dozens of over the years, the kind you assume you will never think about again once the episode ends. Mordecai and Rigby eventually win anyway. Ferguson's head explodes in a burst of gore that the show plays entirely for comedy, and the episode moves on. Except the show did not actually let him go, and neither, as it turns out, did his own family. Roughly 2 years later, in the story of regular show's timeline, the fourth season opens with an episode called Exit 9B, which begins about as ominously as anything the series ever attempted. A dark, apocalyptic cold open, a remixed and unsettling version of the theme music, and a mysterious bearded stranger capturing every member of the park staff except Mordecai and Rigby, who narrowly escape 2 months into the future using a time machine introduced in an earlier episode. What they discover once they arrive is that their friends have been brainwashed into entirely new identities, and that the park itself has been seized and is being converted into the site of a new Hafugway off-ramp called Exit 9B. The man behind all of it eventually reveals himself as Garrett Bobby Ferguson Jr., the son of the very GBF who died at the coffee shop 2 seasons earlier, and his plan turns out to be considerably more ambitious than his father's ever was. He is not actually interested in the highway itself. He wants to use its construction as cover for opening a portal to the underworld, one large enough to drag back every single villain the park staff has ever defeated across the run of the show, up to and including his own father, so that the resurrected army of old enemies can finally have their revenge all at once. Mordecai and Rigby spend the rest of the episode racing to restore their friends' memories one by one, and the resulting battle brings back an almost overwhelming roll call of the show's entire history of antagonists in a single sustained, frenetic sequence: the Night Owl, the Hot Dogs, the Destroyer of Worlds, an entire graveyard of old grudges walking again at once, all because a father lost a game 2 seasons earlier, and a son could not let that loss go unanswered. There is a detail in the episode's ending worth sitting with for a moment, because it says something quietly sharp about the whole chain. Once the villains are defeated and the portal collapses, dragging the resurrected army back into it, along with both Fergusons, the elder Ferguson's very last words to his son are not comfort, and they are not forgiveness. He tells his son that he has managed to break the universe record for disappointing your father. That is the line the show chooses to close this particular father-son relationship on, and it recontextualizes the entire revenge plot retroactively. This was never really about Mordecai and Rigby at all, not fundamentally. It was about a son trying, across an absurd, cosmic, deeply disproportionate scheme, to earn the approval of a man who was apparently unwilling to give it, even in the last exchange they would ever have. The elder GBF's obsession with an arcade high score, established as pathetic and self-serving back in Season 2, produced a son who inherited that same hunger for validation and simply had a much bigger canvas to act it out on. A demand for respect over $40 in loose change echoed and escalated through a father who could not accept losing a video game with any grace, produced 2 seasons later a full-scale assault on the park involving nearly every villain in the show's history, and it is worth noticing that this entire chain runs almost entirely on ego rather than malice. Nobody in this particular thread of the show wanted to destroy the universe out of some grand cosmic principle. They wanted, at every single stage, simply to be respected, or to be forgiven, or to be good enough in the eyes of somebody who was never quite going to say so. That is a very small, very human motive to have produced one of the largest single battles the show ever staged, and it is exactly the kind of scale mismatch that this whole video is built around noticing. Let's stay small a while longer, because not every consequence in this show needed a cosmic villain to set it in motion. Some of the longest, quietest chains in regular show run entirely through Rigby, and specifically through a piece of his past that the show treats, for years, as pure comic ammunition rather than as the wound it eventually turns out to be. The fact that Rigby never finished high school gets raised early and often, almost always as a punchline, usually delivered by Mordecai in the middle of some unrelated argument, a quick jab about his friend's intelligence that lands and moves on before anyone has to sit with it. The show is not consistent across its run about exactly how this happened. In some references, it is framed simply as Rigby dropping out rather than accepting expulsion, and elsewhere, notably in the feature film, it is framed as an actual expulsion that happened alongside Mordecai, tied to a specific incident the two of them caused together as teenagers. The inconsistency itself is almost fitting, honestly, because it mirrors the way Rigby seems to relate to his own past for most of the series. Unexamined, slightly contradictory, more comfortable staying vague about it than actually confronting what happened and why. For season after season, this is simply a fact about him, filed alongside his laziness and his instinct for shortcuts, one more piece of evidence that he is the less responsible half of the friendship. Mordecai got a diploma. Mordecai, by some accounts, went on afterward to a junior art college, before dropping that too. Rigby got nothing, and for a long time, the show does not seem interested in asking what that nothing actually cost him. Then Eileen enters the picture in a serious, sustained way, and the joke starts to develop weight it did not have before. In an episode called The Eileen Plan, Rigby, feeling for the first time genuinely insecure about whether he is intellectually good enough for the woman he is dating, decides on his own, without anyone pushing him into it, to go back and finish the high school diploma he never completed. It is a small, almost private act of self-improvement, motivated by love, rather than by any external pressure from Benson or Mordecai or the show's plot machinery, and it is one of the first moments in the entire series where Rigby's chronic avoidance of responsibility gets reframed, even briefly, as something with an actual emotional root underneath it rather than a fixed comedic trait. He does not manage it gracefully. He cancels dates to study, which upsets Eileen in ways that momentarily threaten the very relationship he is trying to prove himself worthy of, and the show plays some of that tension for the kind of low-key comedy it always specialized in. But the impulse underneath the mess is sincere, and it does not evaporate once the immediate episode ends the way so many of Rigby's initiatives historically had. By the time the show reaches its final stretch, this small, private decision has become one of the largest single measures of how far Rigby has actually grown. The finale's flash forward, showing the entire cast years into the future, gives him precisely the outcome that Thread had been quietly building toward: a completed education, a marriage to Eileen, and by most accounts, children of his own, an entire stable adult life, constructed on a foundation the show first laid, almost as an afterthought, in a single mid-series episode about a boyfriend feeling insecure. It is worth being honest here about where the documented facts end and the interpretation begins. The show does state plainly, through multiple episodes and through the finale's own framing, that Rigby eventually completes his diploma and settles into family life with Eileen. What is interpretation, not confirmed fact, is the reading that this arc represents the show's clearest statement about how growth actually happens for people like Rigby. Not through some single dramatic turning point, but through a slow, embarrassing, frequently interrupted process of doing the unglamorous thing you have been avoiding for years. Motivated by love rather than by any grand realization. The show never announces this thesis out loud. It simply keeps returning to Rigby's unfinished education as a quiet, recurring pressure point until one day, without much fanfare, that pressure resolves. A single insecure moment about not feeling smart enough for a girlfriend turned out to be the seed of the most substantial personal transformation the show ever gave its most chronically undeveloped character, and none of it would have happened if Eileen herself, patient in a way almost nobody else in Rigby's life had ever been with him, had not simply kept showing up. There is a smaller version of this same pattern buried inside that very first episode, so small it barely counts as its own thread, but it belongs here anyway because it shows how early the show learned this particular trick, while Mordecai and Rigby are still messing around before the wall gets broken. Rigby tries to convince Mordecai that a ridiculous, hip-shaking dance move called ham-boning is a skill worth taking seriously, and Mordecai shoots the idea down without hesitation. Rigby, undeterred, insists that ham-boning will save his life one day. It sounds like exactly the kind of throwaway line a show fires off in its opening minutes, purely for rhythm, a joke that exists to be forgotten 30 seconds later. Except later in that same episode, while Skips is trapped and in genuine danger from a monster on the moon, it is Rigby's ham-boning, deployed with no plan and no dignity, that manages to distract the creature long enough for Skips to break free. A joke about a useless skill turns out, within the same 11 minutes, to be the thing that saves somebody's life. It is a tiny example, almost a warm-up exercise for everything the show would go on to do at a much larger scale, but it tells you something true about how this series was built from its very first episode onward. Nothing said early was ever entirely wasted, and nothing dismissed as silly was ever fully off the table for later use. Now let's go back to Garrett Bobby Ferguson one more time, because there is a piece of this particular story that extends past the edge of the show itself, out into the real world, in a way that very few pieces of animated television history ever managed to do. Ferguson was never an original creation built from nothing. He is, quite openly, a parody of a real competitive gamer named Billy Mitchell, a man who was, for years, celebrated as one of the greatest arcade players alive, credited with the first documented perfect score on Pac-Man and with a series of record-setting performances on Donkey Kong that made him something close to a legend within that specific insular community. The show leaned into the resemblance without much subtlety. Ferguson's face is drawn to closely echo Mitchell's actual appearance, and the entire premise of a man whose sense of self-worth is built entirely around defending an arcade high score reads as a fairly direct, if exaggerated, commentary on the culture surrounding competitive retro gaming and the sometimes fragile egos it produces. This did not go unnoticed by the man it was parodying. In 2015, Mitchell filed a lawsuit against Cartoon Network over the use of his likeness without permission, a case that was ultimately thrown out of court, with the ruling essentially concluding that a floating, exploding, disembodied bearded head could not reasonably be understood as a literal, damaging reproduction of a real person's identity. That alone would already be a strange enough footnote, a cartoon joke escalating into actual litigation, but the story does not stop there, and this is the part that borders on the uncanny. Around 2017 and 2018, several years after Mitchell filed and lost that lawsuit, and roughly 7 years after the episode itself first aired, an independent investigation into Mitchell's real competitive gaming history found strong evidence that he had, in fact, cheated to achieve at least some of his most famous scores, using emulated rather than original arcade hardware in ways that violated the rules of legitimate competition. His records were subsequently stripped from the official leaderboards that had verified them for years, and his reputation within the competitive gaming community, the very thing GBF's fictional obsession had been built to gently mock, took a serious and lasting hit. A joke about a man whose entire identity depended on defending a high score that might not have been entirely earned turned out, within less than a decade, to have been aimed at someone whose real high scores were not entirely earned either. Nobody involved in making high score could have known this would happen when the episode aired in February of 2011. This is not a case of the show predicting anything through any special insight. It is simply the strange, occasionally uncomfortable way that satire sometimes catches up with its own target years after the fact. A small parody rippling outward into a real legal dispute, and, later, into a real public reckoning that the writers had no way of anticipating and almost certainly never intended. Let's talk for a moment about a decision that had nothing to do with plot at all, because some of the most far-reaching consequences in this show's history were not narrative choices made by writers, but practical staffing and budget choices made by people simply trying to get episodes finished on time. Sam Marin, the voice actor behind Benson, Pops, and Muscle Man, three of the show's most central and most emotionally distinct characters, was not hired for that role through some elaborate casting process built around a specific creative vision for how those three characters should sound in relation to each other. He was a friend. He and J.G. Quintel attended the California Institute of the Arts together in the same class, and Marin had helped Quintel on those earlier student films long before either of them had any reason to think a television series would come of any of it. When Regular Show needed voices, Marin was already there, already trusted, already willing to do the work, and the decision to have him carry three major characters instead of one appears, from everything available about the show's production history, to have been a practical solution to a staffing need rather than a deliberate thematic statement about the hidden emotional unity of Benson's anger, Pops's gentleness, and Muscle Man's performative toughness. And yet that is exactly the reading of fans built around the choice, once the show had run long enough to make the pattern impossible to ignore. Listening closely, you can hear the same underlying human voice moving between three completely different emotional registers episode after episode. The exhausted authority figure, the sweet, oblivious innocent, the loud, insecure performer. Whether or not Quintel or Marin ever consciously intended for that vocal continuity to suggest some deeper connection between the three characters is not something either of them has stated outright, as far as the public record shows, and it would be dishonest to present that deeper reading as confirmed authorial intent. What is confirmed is simpler and, in its own way, just as interesting. A friendship formed in an animation classroom, entirely unrelated to storytelling ambition, became one of the most structurally distinctive features of the finished show's sound. A texture viewers absorb for 8 seasons without necessarily being able to name why certain scenes involving those three characters felt connected to each other on some level beneath the dialogue. Practical convenience, threaded through a friendship that began years before the show existed, quietly became one of Regular Show's most recognizable creative signatures. A similar kind of accident produced the sound of the show itself. Regular Show never had a traditional recurring theme song most viewers would sing along to the way you might with other cartoons of its era. Instead, each episode opens on a blurred sound followed by a ticking clock, a small piece of audio texture rather than a proper musical statement. But the score underneath the episodes, the music that gives the show so much of its specific tone, its wistfulness in the quiet moments, and its overblown grandeur in the cosmic ones, came from Mark Mothersbaugh, a founding member of the band Devo, and the way he came to be involved traces back to a fairly casual decision Quintel made while he was still developing the original pilot, well before there was any guarantee the show would even be picked up. Quintel considered asking Mothersbaugh to score the project sent along the pilot's animatic with the request, and Mothersbaugh said yes. On top of that, the show's now recognizable habit of leaning on real, licensed music from the 1980s in its montage sequences did not begin as a deliberate stylistic mandate handed down from the top. According to the show's own production history, Quintel and his staff writers initially used copyrighted songs simply as placeholder material while assembling early animatics, a purely practical shortcut to test pacing and energy before the final score was locked in. Network executives, watching those early cuts, liked what they heard enough to ask whether the crew actually wanted to use some of that music in the finished broadcast episodes, provided it could be licensed and afforded. What began as a temporary editing convenience turned into one of the show's defining aesthetic fingerprints, the specific, warm, slightly overripe 80s sound that fans would later build entire theories around, reading the show's nostalgia not as an incidental preference, but as a deliberate argument about memory and the way certain decades refuse to let go of the people who grew up inside them. The theory about nostalgia as a kind of haunting, discussed at length elsewhere in the show's fandom, becomes considerably more poignant once you know that the soundtrack, carrying so much of that emotional weight, exists largely because of a scheduling shortcut a group of animators took to save themselves time on an early cut, not because anyone sat down at the very beginning and decided the show needed to sound like somebody's childhood. Let's return to Exit 9, Be One More Time, because there is a second, quieter thread buried inside that episode that most people miss on a first watch, tucked into the background of a much louder story. In the middle of all that brainwashing and portal building and villain resurrection, a brand new character wanders into the plot almost by accident. A young intern named Thomas, arriving for his very first day of work at the park, hoping to secure a good recommendation for school credit, and instead walking directly into the single most chaotic afternoon in the park's history. He spends most of the episode simply trying to find anyone who can tell him where he is supposed to report, wandering through a landscape of brainwashed coworkers and exploding villains with the mounting confusion of someone who signed up for the wrong summer job entirely. It plays, in the moment, as pure comic relief, a fish-out-of-water gag dropped into the middle of an epic battle for tonal contrast. Nobody watching that first broadcast in 2012 had any particular reason to think this new intern character would matter beyond that one episode. He became a fixture instead. Thomas stuck around, appearing across dozens of subsequent episodes as a recurring member of the park staff, and then, in an episode called The Real Thomas, the show pulled the rug out from under everyone who had simply accepted him as a slightly awkward young goat trying to get through his internship. He is revealed to actually be a Russian spy operating under deep cover, real name Nikolai, sent to infiltrate the park for reasons the show plays for the same absurdist comic escalation it applies to almost everything else. It is a strange, almost tonally whiplash-inducing reveal for a character who had spent so long simply being the butt of low-stakes workplace jokes, and it retroactively recolors every earlier appearance he made, the same way learning about Skips and Mona recolors every earlier joke about his skipping. A throwaway new hire gag, introduced purely to add scale and specificity to one already enormous episode, quietly grew into one of the show's stranger and longer-running character mysteries, resolved years after most viewers had stopped wondering whether there was anything more to him at all. There is another detail buried in that same corner of the show's back half worth pulling out, because it involves an object that seems, on the surface, purely decorative, and turns out instead to be one of the load-bearing pieces of the entire finale's internal logic. In an episode called Cheer Up Pops, airing near the very end of the series, a character introduced as one of the anthropomorphic disc formats the show had been building an entire mythology around, referred to affectionately by fans as the Blu-ray Girl, produces a physical set of discs documenting the park crew's adventures, essentially compiling the show's own history into a tangible, recorded archive. That archive gets buried in the ground as a kind of time capsule, treated in the moment as a sweet, sentimental gesture, a way for the characters to preserve their own memories against the possibility of forgetting. It does not read, on first viewing, like the setup for anything larger. It reads like a quiet closing gift between friends. It becomes essential to how the universe survives. When the finale's cosmic battle between Pops and anti-Pops ends in the same mutually destructive stalemate that had apparently repeated billions of times before, resetting reality and erasing the memory of everything that came before it, Mordecai and Rigby find themselves reliving the events of the very first episode all over again, seemingly with no awareness that anything unusual has happened. It is only because those buried discs survived the reset, an anomaly the show frames as a glitch in the fabric of the reboot, rather than something anyone deliberately engineered, that the two of them are able to recover any memory of their previous life at all, piece together that something has gone wrong, and use that fragmentary recollection to travel back to the moment of the final battle and change its outcome. A sentimental, throwaway act of archiving from 2 episodes before the finale, treated by the characters themselves as nothing more than a nice way to remember old times, turns out to be the single mechanical detail that keeps an entire cosmic reset from completely erasing everyone's ability to notice that something needed fixing. Bury a record of yourself somewhere durable enough, and even the end of a universe cannot entirely take it away from you. That is, admittedly, as much a poetic reading of the mechanics as it is a strict plot summary, and the show itself frames the survival of those discs as a fortunate glitch rather than something any character consciously arranged for this exact purpose. But the causal chain underneath the poetry is completely literal and completely verifiable. Without the burial of that time capsule, the finale's own internal logic gives Mordecai and Rigby no route back to consciousness of what they had lost. And without that consciousness, there is no rescue. And without the rescue, the show's own established pattern suggests the universe simply resets again, the same way it apparently had billions of times before, forever. Now let's go all the way back to that final battle itself, because underneath all its noise and its scale, at its actual mechanical core, it is one more story about a single, small suggestion changing something that had been fixed and unchangeable for what the show frames as billions of years. When the park crew arrives on Lollyland, the native world where Pops and his brother were born, they are shown a record of every previous encounter between the two of them, going back further than any of the characters can properly comprehend, an accumulated history preserved by the locals specifically so that whoever eventually arrived to witness the latest confrontation would understand what they were walking into. The pattern in every one of those recorded encounters is identical. Pops and anti-pops meet. They fight. The fight ends in a draw because their power is, by design, perfectly balanced against each other, an equilibrium built into the very cosmology of their existence. And every single time that draw occurs, the universe itself resets, erased and rebuilt from nothing, over and over. For a length of time, the show does not even attempt to make comprehensible in ordinary terms. The being tasked with observing all of this, one of the native guardians of the planet, tells the group directly that she has never once seen the battle end any other way. Only a stalemate, only a reset. Forever, apparently, until this particular iteration of the cycle. It is Mordecai, not Pops, not any of the older or wiser characters present, who breaks that pattern. Faced with a fight everyone in the room understands has never once gone differently across an incomprehensible span of cosmic history, Mordecai suggests something almost embarrassingly simple by comparison. Lay traps. Give Pops some kind of tactical advantage he has apparently never had in any previous encounter, something none of his infinite past incarnations thought to try, or were perhaps never permitted to try, against an opponent who has always met him on equal footing before. It is the same basic instinct that drove the entire earlier arc of regular show's small stakes stories, the scrappy, slightly desperate improvisation of someone with no real power trying to find an edge against someone who technically has all of it. Pops is initially resistant to the idea, and the show frames his hesitation as meaningful rather than incidental. This is, after all, a war he has apparently been fighting the exact same way, honorably and directly, across a time span longer than most civilizations have existed, and the suggestion to change tactics now, at what might be the final iteration of an eternal cycle, is itself a kind of small rebellion against however things are supposed to go. The traps work, in the sense that they land, and then Anti-Pops simply walks out of them unscathed, which forces the confrontation back onto the same honest, direct terms it has apparently always been fought on. But the fact that the traps were attempted at all matters more than whether they succeeded, because it is the first documented deviation from an unbroken, eons-long pattern, and once one deviation has occurred, the rest of the encounter stops being predictable in the way every previous iteration apparently was. Streaming, an entirely unrelated villain from a completely different corner of the show's mythology, arrives uninvited to pursue his own vendetta and inadvertently throws his forces in alongside Anti-Pops, adding a variable the ancient cosmic pattern presumably never had to account for before. Old allies and old enemies from across the entire 8-season run arrive to fight on one side or the other, a convergence of the show's entire history assembling itself around a confrontation that, by every account, the natives of Lollyland could offer was never supposed to include any of them. And at the climax of it, when the brothers finally reach the point where their power is roughly matched, and a fist fight between them threatens to trigger the same universe-ending draw it always had before, Pops does something none of his prior incarnations are shown to have done. Rather than meeting his brother's violence with more violence, he closes the distance and embraces him, an act the show frames through the way the animation itself slows down and softens around it, as something closer to genuine love than to combat technique. That embrace weakens anti-pops in a way straightforward, fighting never had across billions of prior attempts, and it gives Pops the opening to do what no previous version of this endless story had apparently ever managed: end the cycle permanently at the cost of his own life by carrying both himself and his brother into a star, rather than allowing the fight to reset the universe and simply begin the entire eternal pattern all over again. None of that ending exists without Mordecai's initial suggestion to try something different. It is worth being precise about what is documented here and what is closer to a reading built on top of the documented material. The show does explicitly establish, through the Guardian's own testimony, that every previous encounter between Pops and Anti-Pops ended identically, in mutual destruction and a total reset for a length of time longer than any character can properly measure. It does explicitly show Mordecai proposing the trap strategy as something new, and it does explicitly show the final outcome breaking from every prior iteration of the pattern, ending not in a draw and a reset, but in a deliberate, chosen sacrifice that allows the surviving cast to remember what happened and move forward into actual futures rather than an erased slate. What the show leaves is interpretation, because it never draws the through line as explicitly as this, is the idea that Mordecai's small tactical suggestion, the same scrappy underdog instinct that had powered every minor scheme across 8 seasons of low-stakes plotting, is the specific hinge that allowed us a war older than the universe itself to finally end in something other than an infinite loop. But the sequence of events supports that reading closely enough that it is difficult to watch the finale and not arrive there anyway. A groundskeeper who never quite escaped the reputation of being the more responsible half of a fundamentally irresponsible friendship, a young man whose biggest prior achievements in the show consisted of things like breaking an arcade world record and covering a hole in a wall with a poster, is the one who introduces the single variable that ends a cosmic stalemate. Everyone else, including the beings whose entire existence the war concerned, had apparently accepted as permanent and unbreakable. If there is a single sentence this whole video has been circling since that very first broken wall, it might be exactly this one. Nothing in this show was ever too small to matter later, and the biggest ending regular show ever gave its audience was made possible by the same kind of scrappy, undignified, faintly ridiculous problem-solving instinct that had been driving its smallest, silliest plots since the very first episode. Let's slow down here and sit with something quieter for a while, because not every consequence in this show needed to be cosmic to matter, and one of the gentlest examples involves a decision the writers made about a character's future rather than a decision any character made within the story itself. For a long stretch of the series, Margaret exists inside a fairly familiar structure for this kind of workplace comedy. The object of the protagonist's affection, tethered narratively to his emotional arc, present largely in relation to whether or how Mordecai's feelings for her are progressing, Plenty of long-running shows built around a young male lead and his will he won't he romantic interest would have kept that character orbiting the protagonist indefinitely, bringing her back again and again purely to service his story whenever the writers needed a new wrinkle in his arc. Regular Show, at a certain point, made a different choice. Margaret is given her own ambition, journalism specifically, and rather than finding a way to keep her circling the park indefinitely, the show lets her leave to actually pursue it, treating her departure with a level of seriousness that surprised some viewers watching at the time, precisely because it was not the outcome that kind of narrative structure usually delivers. She does return periodically afterward, visiting, remaining friendly, present at moments that call for her presence, but she does not orbit Mordecai's emotional gravity in the way the show's earlier seasons might have led you to expect she always would. That relatively small structural decision, treating a supporting character's own ambitions as more important than the convenience of keeping her available for a still unresolved love triangle, changes the entire shape of where Mordecai's story is eventually allowed to go. Because Margaret is permitted to leave, and because CJ's relationship with him eventually runs its course and ends as well, by the time the finale reaches its flash forward into the future, Mordecai does not end up paired off with either of the two women the show spent years building emotional tension around. He ends up married to someone the audience had never met before that moment at all, a bat named Steph, who appears with almost no prior screen time, and the choice to end his romantic arc that way produced one of the more debated decisions in the show's entire run. Some fans read it as evidence of something genuinely wise the writers were trying to say about how the people you spend your 20s agonizing over are frequently not the people you eventually build an actual life with. Others have pointed out, more skeptically, that ending the story with an entirely new character sidesteps having to definitively choose a side in the long-running fandom debate over whether Mordecai belonged with Margaret or with CJ, and there is likely at least some truth folded into both of those readings simultaneously. What is documented, rather than interpreted, is the earlier structural decision that made either version of that ending possible in the first place, by letting Margaret go and giving her ambitions somewhere to actually lead, and by eventually letting the relationship with CJ conclude rather than persist indefinitely in unresolved tension. The writers cleared the emotional and narrative space that Steph would later occupy. A choice made seasons earlier, treating a supporting character with more respect than the genre strictly required, is the quiet reason the finale had room to end Mordecai's story somewhere genuinely surprising, rather than in whichever direction the fandom had been arguing about for years. There is a production-level chain worth walking through as well, because the biggest tonal shift the show ever made, the hard turn into full science fiction that dominates its final stretch, did not happen because the writers simply woke up one morning wanting to tell a different kind of story. It happened, according to the documented account of how the series wound down, because the show was given a defined ending point by the network, and Quintel himself had already begun developing what would eventually become his next project, a series called Close Enough that would go on to air after Regular Show concluded. Once a show knows it has a fixed number of episodes left, rather than an open-ended future, the writer's room tends to behave differently than it would if the story could simply continue indefinitely. Threads that might otherwise have been stretched out get compressed. Stakes that might otherwise have built gradually over additional seasons get accelerated into whatever runway remains. The park being physically ripped off the earth and turned into a fugitive spaceship, the cast becoming reluctant intergalactic rebels, the sudden arrival of entire new alien crews and cosmic relics and hierarchies of godlike beings the show had never previously found room to explore. All of that escalation clusters specifically in the seasons where the writers already knew the clock was running, and it is difficult to read that timing as coincidental. A scheduling reality, a network decision about how many seasons a show would be allowed to run, and a creator's own attention beginning to shift toward whatever came next, together produced the specific shape of the ending regular show actually gave itself, a shape considerably more science fictional and considerably more emotionally serialized than the loose, episodic slacker comedy the show had spent its first several seasons being. Whether the writers always privately intended to go this big, eventually, given enough time, is something we cannot verify and should not claim as settled fact. What is documented is simply that the ending arrived on a schedule set partly by circumstances outside the writer's room, and that schedule shaped the actual size and speed of the story fans ultimately watched unfold. There is a smaller, gentler version of this same escalating pattern worth mentioning too, because it shows how the show's tone crept toward genuine cosmic weight through what looks, at first glance, like nothing more than a seasonal gimmick. Regular show's Christmas specials treat Santa Claus within the show's universe as a completely real being with genuine and considerable cosmic power, capable of intervening directly in the kind of large-scale supernatural crises the park staff usually has to handle themselves. On its own, in any given individual episode, that reads as a fairly ordinary bit of holiday special license, the kind of thing plenty of cartoons do without it meaning anything larger about their underlying rules. But because the show kept returning to this same conceit across multiple holiday specials, treating Santa's reality and power with the same casual, unblinking seriousness it extended to death, to the guardians of eternal youth, to every other cosmic figure the park staff had already encountered, those specials quietly reinforced and expanded the audience's sense of exactly how populated and how serious the show's hidden supernatural order actually was. Well before the Pops and Anti-Pops reveal gave that order its final, largest shape, each individual holiday special was, by itself, a small, low-stakes seasonal choice. Stacked together across the years, they built up an accumulated sense that this particular fictional universe simply worked that way, that the impossible was routine here rather than exceptional, and that groundwork made the eventual scale of the finale feel earned rather than arriving out of nowhere. Nobody making the first Christmas special was necessarily thinking 8 seasons ahead toward a war between cosmic twins. But every subsequent choice to keep treating the show's holiday supernatural elements with total sincerity added one more small brick to a foundation the finale would eventually need to be able to stand on. Once you start noticing this pattern, the show becomes almost impossible to watch the same way again, because small causes and enormous delayed effects turn out to be everywhere in it, not just in the handful of threads dramatic enough to build an entire episode's plot around. Consider, for a moment, how many of the show's biggest recurring artifacts and relationships trace back to a single origin point that could easily have gone differently. The hammer skips occasionally produces from somewhere off screen, treated by the show as a last resort, reserved for moments when ordinary problem solving has already failed, exists within the same broader category of ancient, dangerous objects as the keyboard from episode 1, and the show never fully explains where either of them actually came from before they entered the story, only that they were there, waiting, in an attic or in Skip's keeping, for exactly the right combination of desperate circumstances to bring them back out. Fans have theorized for years that these objects form part of a larger, unseen system the writers sketched out, but never had the runtime to fully reveal. A coin that grants wishes, a board game that can rewrite reality, a video game cabinet that can summon ghosts, each one presumably sitting quietly somewhere in the world of the show, waiting for its own small triggering event, the way the keyboard waited for a hole in a wall and the hammer waited for whatever crisis first required it. That theory is speculation, clearly labeled as such even by the fans who built it, since the show itself never confirms a unified system connecting all these artifacts. But the pattern of small objects with outsized latent power, introduced quietly and then reactivated years later at exactly the moment the story needs them most, is not speculation at all. It is simply how this show was built. Episode after episode, artifact after artifact, right down to its very last hours. The same logic applies to the show's recurring fixation on pairs, something the fandom has spent considerable time mapping across the entire run. Mordecai and Rigby, Pops and Anti-Pops, Skips, and the version of himself he left behind when Mona died, Margaret and CJ representing two different futures. Mordecai kept circling without choosing, Muscle Man and High Five Ghost, an owner and the son he spent decades quietly protecting. Every one of those pairings began somewhere specific and small, a doodle of a raccoon, a word drawn from a hat, a girl at a school dance who disliked violence, a floating bearded head defending an arcade score. None of those origin points looked, at the moment they happened, like the beginning of a structural principle that would end up organizing the show's entire emotional architecture. They looked like ordinary choices, the kind any writer makes dozens of times in a single script without expecting any of them to matter more than the others. It is only in hindsight, watching the full 8 seasons stacked up against each other, that you can see how consistently this show took its smallest, most disposable seeming decisions and let them quietly accumulate into its largest, most permanent structures. There is one more small, human detail worth carrying with us before we start bringing this all the way back down to the ground, because it involves grief again, and it involves an object most viewers would never think twice about. Skips is shown, across a number of episodes, with a particular attachment to motorcycles, treated by the show as simply another one of his many competencies, the same way he can fix anything, or lift anything, or solve anything. Fans have noted, though, that his choice of motorcycles specifically, rather than walking or even driving something more ordinary, fits the same emotional logic as his decision to skip rather than walk after Mona's death, a form of motion different enough from what he used to do with her that it does not reopen the wound every single time he moves through the world, but which he still returns to again and as if some part of him needs the motion itself to stay close to what he lost. There is no scene in the show that confirms this reading directly, and it should be treated honestly as interpretation rather than established fact, the kind of quiet pattern recognition fans do naturally when a character's grief has already been established clearly enough elsewhere that smaller, unexplained habits start to seem like extensions of it rather than coincidences. But once you know about Mona, it becomes very hard to watch Skips get on a motorcycle in some completely unrelated episode with no dialogue about her anywhere nearby and not feel the shape of that 200-year-old loss sitting quietly underneath an otherwise ordinary scene. That is, in its own smaller way, exactly the same structure as everything else we have walked through tonight. Something small happens. Nobody flags it as significant at the time, and it keeps returning softly for as long as the story continues, whether or not anyone watching consciously notices it is there. It is worth pausing, too, on just how directly the show's own writers seem to understand this principle about their characters, even if they never announced it as a formal rule. The excellent challenge, an episode fans frequently point to as the show in miniature, is built entirely around a trucker hat that says the word excellent on it, awarded to anyone who can finish an enormous plate of eggs within a set time limit. On paper, it is one of the silliest premises the show ever attempted, and yet the show stages it with the emotional weight of a life or death ordeal, complete with a coma and a vision quest, because the actual stakes of the episode were never really about the eggs or the hat at all. They were about whether Rigby's best friend would go through something genuinely difficult purely because it mattered to him. The hat itself is meaningless. What the hat represents, the willingness to suffer a little for somebody you love without needing a bigger reason than that, is everything. This is, in a sense, the entire show's philosophy about consequence laid out plainly in a single half hour. Small, ridiculous-seeming objects and decisions carry enormous emotional weight, not because of what they literally are, but because of who was willing to go through something for their sake. Every chain we have followed tonight, the keyboard, the arcade game, the school dance, the doodle of a raccoon, the buried discs, the trap suggested in the middle of a battle billions of years in the making, runs on that exact same fuel. Something small becomes something enormous because somebody, at some point along the way, cared enough to let it. And the chain, it turns out, has not actually stopped, even now, years after the finale aired, and the credits bubbled on that reunion scene of an older Mordecai and an older Rigby wondering aloud whether the old video games are still sitting in the shed. Regular Show ended its original run in January of 2017, and for a long stretch of years afterward, it existed the way most beloved, concluded shows exist, as a memory, as reruns, as a wiki that kept slowly growing even though nothing new was being added to the canon it documented. Then, in the middle of 2024, word came that a new series drawing on some of the same characters had been greenlit, with Quintel himself returning to steer it under the title Regular Show, The Lost Tapes, and that series went on to premiere in May of 2026. It would be easy to treat that revival as a completely separate event, disconnected from anything we have spent the last several hours walking through, a business decision made nearly a decade after the fact, for reasons having more to do with nostalgia programming and streaming strategy than with anything inside the original show's own internal logic. But sit with it for a moment. Inside the frame, this whole video has been building. A show that began with a hole in a wall covered over by a poster is still, right now, generating new consequences nearly 2 decades after that first, tiny, avoidable mistake. The chain never actually closed. It simply went quiet for a while. And now apparently, it has picked back up again, which means that whatever gets said or drawn or decided inside the lost tapes today may well end up mattering to some other conversation, some other video, some other quiet evening years from now, in exactly the same way a stolen keyboard from a wizard in the bushes ended up mattering to a battle at the end of the universe. There is one more chain worth walking through before we come back down to the ground, and it might be the most explicit the show ever got about this entire subject, because for once, the writers were not building a butterfly effect quietly in the background. They built an entire feature-length movie directly about one. Regular Show, the movie, released in 2015 and confirmed by Quintel as canon to the main series, opens in a devastated future where Rigby is leading the remaining park staff in a desperate rebellion against a half-cyborg madman named Mr. Ross, a former high school teacher now bent on erasing the timeline entirely. Guarding his ultimate weapon is a version of Mordecai who has become estranged from Rigby over some past betrayal severe enough that the two of them are no longer on the same side of this war at all, and the sequence that follows is bleak by the standards of anything the series had shown before. Nearly the entire team is killed, and Rigby only escapes into the past because Benson sacrifices himself and because Mordecai, in one final act of ambiguous loyalty, shoots his former best friend just badly enough to send him backward through time rather than finish him for good. It is frankly one of the darkest images the franchise ever produced, a future built entirely out of a lie nobody in the present timeline has told yet. The lie itself, once the team travels back to Mordecai and Rigby's senior year of high school to find its source, turns out to be almost embarrassingly small for the scale of destruction it eventually causes. Rigby did not get into the college the two of them had dreamed about attending together. Mordecai did, and rather than tell his best friend the truth, rather than risk the two of them growing apart over something as ordinary and survivable as one person getting in somewhere and the other person not, teenage Rigby forged a fake rejection letter, convincing Mordecai that neither of them had gotten in, so that they would stay together instead of drifting into separate futures. That single act of dishonesty, motivated entirely by fear of losing his best friend rather than by any malice, is what indirectly produces the time machine the two of them build together afterward, a project born out of a friendship built on a falsified premise. And it is that same time machine, when it eventually backfires, that creates the Time NATO, the temporal weapon Mr. Ross later steals and weaponizes into the apocalyptic future the movie opens on. A forged letter written by a scared teenager who could not bear the thought of his one real friendship ending on a technicality is the actual root cause of an entire future in which that same friendship ends anyway, catastrophically, with one of them holding a gun on the other. The movie resolves this the way the best version of this show usually resolves things. Not through some grand cosmic fix, but through Rigby finally telling the truth out loud, in front of everyone, at real cost to his own pride and to the friendship he had spent years protecting through deception, and through both of them choosing, once they understand what the lie eventually grows into, not to let their friendship curdle the way its future version had. The dishonest letter gets replaced, in the timeline that survives, with an honest conversation, and the entire apocalyptic future built on top of the lie simply stops existing, erased not by force, but by two people finally being straight with each other about something that had been quietly rotting underneath their friendship since they were teenagers. It is worth saying plainly that this thread is different in kind from most of the others we have walked through tonight, because the show is not leaving you to notice the causal chain on your own here. It hands you the whole mechanism directly: the lie, the machine, the weapon, the war, the unraveling, spelled out across 90 minutes with unusual explicitness for a series that more often let its longest consequences sit quietly in the background for years before painting them off. But it belongs in this same conversation anyway, maybe even at the center of it, because it is the clearest possible statement of the exact principle everything else tonight has been circling. A friendship almost destroys itself, decades later, over a secret so small that a 17-year-old assumed it would be easier to fabricate a piece of paper than to say 4 true sentences out loud to the person he loved most. That is the actual scale most butterfly effects operate on, in fiction and outside of it. Not villainy, not grand design, just somebody at 17 or 23 or 200 years old making the smaller, easier choice in a single, ordinary moment, and the story simply waiting patiently for that choice to come due. Notice, too, how often these chains turn out to be powered by the exact same emotional fuel, no matter how different the surface details look. A frightened teenager forges a letter because he cannot bear to say something true out loud. A grieving young man promises never to fight again because the girl he loves asked him to, and then breaks that promise only once, at the one moment it costs him everything. A father cannot forgive his son even with his last words, and years later that same unhealed hunger for approval drives the son to try to burn down an entire park just to matter to a man who is no longer even alive to notice. None of these are stories about power in the way the word usually gets used. They are stories about people, young and old and immortal, trying to be loved, trying to be forgiven, trying to avoid the small, survivable discomfort of an honest sentence, and reaching instead for whatever shortcut was closest at hand. The show kept dressing this up in cosmic scale, kept handing these ordinary impulses to gods and ghosts and floating disembodied heads. But if you strip away the explosions, what is actually driving almost every one of the chains we followed tonight is something you would recognize instantly from your own life on a much smaller and much quieter stage. That, more than any single plot mechanic, might be the real reason this show still gets watched at 2 a.m. by people who have long since memorized every episode. It never really needed the cosmic stakes to be true. It only needed them to be honest about what usually causes them. Let's come back now to that wall, because that is where we started tonight, and it feels right to end somewhere close to it too. A hole gets punched into drywall by two young men wrestling around when they should have been working. They do not know how to pay for the damage, so they reach for the nearest available shortcut, and the shortcut turns out to be far more powerful and far more dangerous than either of them understood when they picked it up. They use it badly. They almost lose someone because of it. And when the danger passes, when the object that caused all of it has been taken away and broken in half as punishment, the actual hole is still there, unrepaired, exactly where it started. Mordecai solves that specific, narrow problem with a poster. He does not solve the wall. He just makes it so nobody has to look at the damage anymore. That is such a small, human, almost embarrassingly relatable way to handle a problem, and it is worth noticing that the show never treats it as a mistake worth revisiting or correcting later on. The wall presumably stayed broken underneath that poster for the rest of the series, quietly, the way most of our own unresolved things do, covered rather than fixed, out of sight rather than out of existence. There is something genuinely moving once you have spent this many hours walking through 8 seasons of Consequence in realizing that the show's very first instinct, cover the damage rather than repair it, turned out to be a kind of quiet prophecy for how almost everything else in the story would eventually work. Nothing in regular show ever really got fixed in the tidy, permanent way sitcoms sometimes pretend problems get fixed. Skips never stopped grieving Mona. He simply built an entire 2-century identity around carrying that grief forward without letting it stop him. Rigby never magically became someone who did not struggle with responsibility. He slowly, awkwardly, over years, did the specific unfinished thing that had been sitting underneath his life since adolescence, motivated by love rather than by some sudden personality transplant. The cosmic war between pops and anti-pops did not get resolved through a clean victory that erased the conflict from existence. It got resolved through an embrace, through pops choosing to love the very thing that had been trying to destroy him for the entirety of both their existences, ending the war not by winning it in the way wars are usually won, but by refusing, at the very last possible moment, to keep fighting it the way it had always been fought before. Cover the damage. Carry the weight forward instead of setting it down. Change one small thing about how you respond, even if you cannot change the underlying situation itself. That is not a moral the show ever announces out loud, the way after school specials used to announce their morals directly into the camera. It is simply the pattern that emerges, quietly, consistently, once you have followed enough of these threads all the way from their smallest possible starting point to wherever they eventually landed. What this show seems to understand, more patiently and more thoroughly than almost anything else made for its particular audience during its particular era, is that the difference between a forgettable Tuesday and the day that changes everything is very rarely visible while you are actually living through it. Nobody watching Mordecai tape a poster over a hole in September of 2010 could have told you that same object would be back in his hands at the actual end of the universe. Nobody watching a teenage boy promise a girl he loved that he would never fight again could have told you that promise would eventually produce an immortal groundskeeper capable of holding an entire cosmic order together through sheer patience alone. Nobody watching a floating bearded head lose an arcade game to two disrespected groundskeepers could have told you his death would echo 2 seasons later through his own son, or that the joke itself was quietly mirroring a real man's fall from grace that had not even happened yet. And nobody sitting in a classroom at midnight, exhausted, pulling a scrap of paper with a single word written on it out of a hat, could possibly have told you that the short film that Word produced would still be recognizable in outline in a lollipop-headed man dying inside a star to save a universe that did not exist yet either. That is, in the end, probably the most honest thing this whole video can leave you with. Not a neat lesson about paying attention to every small moment, because that kind of hypervigilance is exhausting and unrealistic and not really how any of us actually get to live. Something gentler than that. A kind of permission to trust that the things you cannot yet see the shape of, the decisions that feel too small to matter, the grief you have not finished carrying, the promise you made once and have quietly kept ever since, without anyone noticing, might still be doing more work than you know, might still be sitting quietly in an attic somewhere, waiting for the one exact moment, years from now, when it turns out to have been the only thing capable of saving everything. The park is still there, if you want to picture it one more time before we go. The cart is parked for the night. The lights in the snack bar are off. Somewhere upstairs, two friends who have known each other since childhood are asleep on top of their blankets, with the television still glowing softly against the dark. Somewhere in the attic below them, an old broken keyboard is sitting exactly where it has always sat, waiting, the way it always has, for nobody to remember it is even there until the day it turns out to be the only thing that can help. And somewhere further out, past the edge of everything anyone in that house could see, even if they were awake to look, a hole in a wall that got covered up instead of fixed. All those years ago is still there too, quiet, patient, part of the structure now, holding nothing against anyone, just waiting the way everything in this show eventually turns out to be waiting for its turn to matter again. Think about how many of the people in this story never got to see the whole shape of what they had started. Rigby never watched himself forge that letter and immediately understood he was building a war machine out of a lie. Walks never looked at Mona across a crowded lunch table on his first day at a new school and understood he was about to become the oldest, steadiest presence a cosmic order would eventually depend on for 2 centuries. A tired art student pulling a scrap of paper out of a hat at midnight never once imagined that the strange little short film it produced would end, decades later, with a lollipop-headed man he had not yet invented dying gently inside a star to save a universe that did not exist yet either. This is, in the end, probably the truest thing anyone could say about causes and their effects, whether you are talking about a cartoon or about your own life. You almost never get to know, in the moment, which version of yourself you are currently building. The version who taped a poster over a hole instead of fixing it had no idea he was rehearsing, in miniature, the exact way an entire universe would eventually need to be saved. And maybe that is the quiet comfort worth taking from a show that spent 8 seasons proving, patiently and without ever announcing it, that nothing you do while nobody is watching is ever really as small as it feels while you are doing it. If tonight gave you something to carry into sleep, a piece of this show you had not quite put together before, or just the company of sitting with it one more time in the dark, that is exactly what these videos are for. If you want more nights like this one, subscribing helps more than you would probably guess, and a like tells me which of these deep dives are actually landing the way I hope they will. I'll be back with more of this soon. For now, let the park settle, let the afternoon be over. Somewhere out past the edge of whatever room you are lying in, the same slow, patient chain of small causes and delayed effects that built this entire show is still quietly running underneath your own life too, and you do not have to go looking for it tonight, and you do not have to solve anything before you close your eyes. Whatever you are carrying tonight, small or enormous, quiet or loud, unresolved or finally, gently, at long last settled, has more time left to become something than you probably think it does right now. Sleep well.